I remember the first time I saw it. Not in a museum, not in a textbook, but described by men who had fought beneath its shadow. They laughed at it at first. They called it ungainly, a milk bottle with wings, a flying beer keg. It was big, heavy, and awkward enough to make neat pilots scoff. I like to think that's the moment the Thunderbolt began to get even meaner, because nothing humbles a machine like mockery, and nothing sharpens a design like contempt. The P-47 did not arrive to charm anyone. It arrived to survive. The Republic designers wrapped an enormous Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double wasp engine into a fuselage built like a vault, and then told pilots to take it up and keep their heads. That engine produced more than 2,000 horsepower. Behind it, tucked into the belly, sat a turbocharger, the size of a car that let the plane breathe where others choked. At 27,000 feet, when German fighters were already wheezing, the Thunderbolt still had appetite. You could feel that power in the throttle. You didn't so much accelerate as you were thrown forward, and the whole airplane answered like a beast waking. When a pilot learned to stop thinking about turning and start thinking about energy, the Jug changed the rules. It wasn't elegant. It never pretended to be. Its wings looked too small for its mass, its fuselage bulky, its landing gear clumsy. But the numbers that matter in combat, rate of dive, ability to convert altitude into speed, raw survivability, those numbers favored the big American. The Thunderbolt could dive like a meteor and climb back like a catapult. It could take a beating and keep flying. For the men on the receiving end, that made all the difference. Early on, that difference cost lives. The P-47 had growing pains. Pilots fresh from trainers bent landing gear and spun out on takeoff. Compressed airflow at speed made the controls heavy, and crews learned the hard lesson of compressibility. Training accidents cost more pilots than Germans did for months. But that brutal schooling produced men who trusted their aircraft. And trust is currency in war. Combat taught the Thunderbolt's pilots a new language. Forget graceful dogfights. Think of angles, altitude, and one deadly notion. Don't trade turning for survival. Boom and zoom became doctrine. Climb high, convert height into speed, dive through the enemy, pour metal into a small, deadly point, and then climb back out before the opposing pilot could get comfortable. The P-47's 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns were not ornamental. They delivered a wall of lead. At distance, the guns were a threat. At convergence, they were annihilation. You could see it in gun camera frames. Wings torn off, fuselages open like tin cans, a pilot's world reduced to a scattered parachute. There is one mission I keep returning to, because it captures the P-47's contradiction. Fragile and indestructible, clumsy and lethal. A pilot returning from a deep penetration mission, aircraft riddled with holes, the canopy blasted, instruments shot away. He limps home, controls sticky, engine coughing, and still the plane answers his will. He puts it down, and the ground crew counts holes until they stop caring. Someone later counted more than 200 strikes in a single airframe. That machine lands again, and the pilot walks away. It's not mechanical poetry, it's stubborn physics. That stubbornness changed how the air war felt for everyone involved. Across Europe, the Thunderbolt's presence began to shift tactical thinking. Bombers needed escorts, and escorts needed endurance. At first, the P-47's range was limited, but field innovation and add-on tanks extended its reach. Numerical superiority mattered. Strategic bombing needed protection. The Jug provided it. It could stay with the formations, soak hits, and punish attackers. German pilots adapted. They tried to force low-altitude turning fights where their fighters had the advantage. The Americans stopped following the bait. They used height as an advantage. From altitude, they dove with speed few could match, their heavy frames carrying kinetic punishment like accusations. Ground troops learned another lesson. The Thunderbolt could be choreographed into walking artillery. With bombs and rockets, the P-47 became the hammer of the Allied advance. It strafed convoys, destroyed locomotives, turned columns into wreckage. I have read accounts from soldiers who learned to fear the deep, rolling rumble of those paddle-bladed props. Once they heard it, there was little time to move. It wasn't just the destruction, it was the certainty that someone above had the power to end a convoy or an ambush in a single pass. The Jug stripped away margins and created panic. This was not just a story of a plane beating other planes. It was the story of an industrial system and a culture of production meeting a battlefield's unforgiving math. The United States built more than 15,000 P-47s. Factories turned out aircraft on a scale that Germany could not match for fighters. The Jug was a product of mass production, but that does not diminish the craftsmanship. Each engine had thousands of precision parts. Each airframe was a puzzle solved again and again by workers who learned speed and quality at the same time. That relentless output meant that losses could be replaced. That attrition wore down opponents who could not match both the machine and the people behind it. There is another layer here: humanity. Pilots and mechanics formed bonds with this machine. They trusted its armor plate behind their seat, the heavy windscreen that could take hits other planes could not. They trusted that if the worst happened, they had a chance to survive. Pilots nicknamed it Jug, not as an insult, but as an acknowledgement. Gabby Gabreski, Richard Bong, and many other aces scored victories in the Thunderbolt. Their stories don't read like vanity. These are men who learned to fight with a partner that would not break. When an engine shuddered and a fuel line sprayed, the plane's mass sometimes bought the pilot the seconds he needed to nurse it home. Confrontations with German jets, like the Me-262, also reveal something important about the Thunderbolt: adaptability. Jets had a clear speed advantage in level flight, but their vulnerabilities lay in takeoff, landing, and when they were forced into certain situations. A diving Thunderbolt could, under the right circumstances, reach terrifying speeds and use energy to its advantage. P-47 pilots learned when to press an attack and when to trade space for survival. A well-timed dive, a raw burst from 8 guns, and a jet might come apart. It was not a simple mismatch, but it proved that a propeller-driven fighter, when used intelligently and in numbers, could still contest the new threat. The Pacific Theater posed a different challenge. Japanese fighters liked the Zero prized maneuverability and range, but they were fragile and lacked armor. The P-47 arrived in a different way there. In the island and jungle war, its resilience and firepower were devastating. The P-47N variant extended range. It escorted B-29s and struck targets many fighters could not reach. The Jug's weight and punch translated into a new kind of dominance, from sky to ground, from tactical to strategic. The nature of aerial combat changed when opponents could no longer count on a single burst to finish an enemy. They had to reckon with a second, third, and fourth salvo. The psychological effect was as important as the physical. I have listened to German pilots describe the moment they realized their old rules no longer applied. They had spent years seeking perfect angles and graceful turns. Then they faced an opponent who refused those terms. Reports filtered up: attack only from above, avoid turning fights, never trust your gauges. The Luftwaffe adapted late and imperfectly. Training sank under attrition. Experienced leaders were lost. The P-47 did not by itself sink an air arm, but it accelerated a process of attrition that industrial capacity made brutal. Tactically, American squadrons learned to coordinate. The Thunderbolt's strength was multiplied by formation discipline, radio communication, and shared doctrine. Pilots used each other's energy states, cut off retreats, and built kill boxes of concentrated fire. It is one thing for a single pilot to master a machine. It is another for a wing of pilots to move like a single organism. That collective learning made the Jug not only survivable, but dominant. The experience of formation flying, of trusting that your wingman will be there, changed the calculus of air combat. Where German tactics often relied on individual initiative, American doctrine increasingly favored mutual support. It proved decisive. If you look at the data, sorties flown, ground targets destroyed, enemy aircraft downed, the numbers read like strategy rewritten. The P-47 destroyed trains, trucks, tanks. It shredded the logistics that keep armies moving. It ground down not just planes, but pathways. By evening, the Luftwaffe's veteran cadre was thinned. By then, replacements were pilots with hours measured in dozens, not hundreds. The P-47 did not just fight. It depleted the pool of experience the enemy needed to operate at scale. The human cost is important to hold. Pilots on both sides fought with courage and conviction. For every tale of a jug bringing someone home, there are stories of aircraft lost and men who never returned. The P-47 does not give us a simplistic moral. It gives us context. It shows what happens when technology and training combine with logistics and production. It teaches a lesson about wins that are often collective, boring, and ugly. Factories running, supply lines intact, maintenance crews working overnight. War is not just made in the sky. It's made in the quiet hum of an assembly line. That hum mattered beyond the conflict. The Thunderbolt's design informed the next generation of combat aircraft. Lessons about survivability, engine performance at altitude, and massed firepower echoed into the jet age. Engineers who had built or maintained jugs carried those experiences into peacetime designs. The P-47's legacy is technical as much as cultural. It stands as a bridge between eras, piston engines that could be pushed hard, airframes that could take punishment, and practices of production that defined modern warfare. The stories have a final common theme: respect. When pilots who once mocked the jug flew captured examples, when commanders who had dismissed it in reports came to see the wreckage, and the men who crawled out of it, their language changed. "We were wrong," they said. "We laughed, and then we learned not to laugh." That is not the kind of phrase historians use lightly. It marks a moment when assumptions collided with reality. It is a small humility that war forces upon those who survive. I have stood in museums beside a restored P-47 and heard its engine start. The sound is a visceral thing, a deep, rolling thunder that vibrates your teeth and takes the breath from your chest. For a moment you can imagine the fields below, the columns of trucks, the towns that smoke cleared. You can imagine a pilot leaning into the cockpit, checking his gauges and trusting the machine beneath him. That trust is not romantic. It is practical and fierce. It is the sound of a partnership between human and machine that earned lives in the balance. The P-47 was not the prettiest plane. It was not the fastest in a straight line. It did not have the cultural halo of some other fighters. But it did something harder. It provided a persistent, reliable advantage that could be counted on. It proved that warfare increasingly rewards systems, design, production, training, logistics, that can be repeated and sustained. In the jug, we see a clear thesis. Resilience multiplied at scale beats finesse when the fight turns to exhaustion. So when we read the records, hear the veterans, and study the film footage, we are not simply recounting technological triumph. We are looking at a narrative about adaptability. Men learned to fly differently. Tactics shifted. Command priorities changed. The P-47 forced a response, and the response reshaped the air war. That is influence of a serious measure. And in the end, when the last jugs rolled into storage yards and the jets took over the sky, the Thunderbolt's mark did not fade. Pilots remembered the way it sounded and the way it saved them. Engineers remembered its lessons. Historians still argue about which plane was best, but those who were there know that the jug gave them a tool that mattered when everything else seemed to fail. The Thunderbolt is a reminder that war is not fair. and that sometimes effectiveness wears the face of an ugly truth. A plane that looks ungainly can be exquisitely useful. A heavy engine can be a liberator. A design that prioritizes survival can reshape doctrine. I don't tell this for nostalgia. I tell it because the P-47 teaches a lesson that is still relevant. When complexity meets purpose, when industry meets need, the result can be decisive.
I've listened to survivors, read reports, and felt the echo of that engine enough to know this. The Jug didn't just fly. It imposed a new kind of order on the sky. It made certain fights unwinnable for the unprepared. And in doing so, it helped change the course of a war. If you stand beside one today, if you let its sound fill the air, you'll understand what they meant when they said it didn't just survive, it conquered.